that brings us to our last speaker of the day, Hans Schwartz. And I think Brother Men sort of referenced his paper in the Q&A session. It's Freemasonry in Revolutionary Boston. This paper explores the truth behind the legends that Freemasons planned key events in the American Revolution by exploring the close relationship between Bostonian Freemasons and their wider Masonic sphere of influence. On the formation of the Sons of Liberty and Stamp Act resistance, the Boston Tea Party, and Paul Revere's right. Hans Schwartz research focuses on Freemasonry in transatlantic networking in the Atlantic colonial period and political organizing in the American Revolutionary period. Hans has presented and published several papers on transatlantic Freemasonry as a cultural, political, and intellectual network, notably at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association, the German Historical Institute, and the QC Conference. Masonically, he is a past master of Mount Carmel Lodge in Lynn, Massachusetts. Over to you, Hans.
Thank you for that introduction. And yes, a lot of my research has focused on politics and political networks. Again, we're moving back from the frontier, but this is sort of the political frontier of the United States. And so we're looking really, and the paper that I've got here is looking at, as Brother Sri said, three major factors in Boston during the American Revolution and in New England. And much of the mystique of American Freemason really goes back to that Masonic connection. We know, yes, Ben Franklin, George Washington, many of these others, 8 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. But what's also interesting is how many of the foot soldiers, the rank and file, the middlemen, and the mid-level revolutionaries were involved. So if we could go to the first slide or the next slide, I'll go over some of the basics. Here we have a 1773 watercolor by a man named Jack Johnson. He was not known to be a Mason, but you can see up there the square and compasses. The building here is the Green Dragon Tavern. Its official name had actually been changed to the Freemasons' Arms when the Lodge of St. Andrews bought the place in 1764. And if you read the caption, it says, "Where we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea, December 16th, 1773. This is one of the major, of course, events in the American Revolution, and we'll come back to it a little bit. But there has always been the legend that it was sort of planned in the lodge. We know the lodge was one of the staging areas for the Indians, and as the quote-unquote Indians or Native Americans, who are, of course, Bostonians in bad costumes. But, you know, as we will see, the records of that night sort of do indicate a cover-up, and there are some other records that let us know that maybe the lodge was involved. But first, I'm going to back it up to the beginning of the revolutionary movement, a group called the Sons of Liberty, which formed during the Stamp Act crisis. And if you don't remember high school U.S. history, I'm not going to lecture on it again because I've already done that as a history teacher recently. But essentially, you had to buy a stamp and put it on everything, and it was just a really unpopular, very odious tax. Now, the Sons of Liberty were groups that formed seemingly spontaneously throughout the colonies to organize resistance to the Stamp Act. And the origins of the Sons have never really been that clearly worked out. And so what I decided to delve into was just what the Masonic overlap is. And I'll give you some of the highlights now, and then you can read the book if you need more. So essentially, what's interesting here, we know the leadership, men like John Hancock, Benjamin Church, an eventual traitor, but sort of the Benedict Arnold of Boston, but at the time seen as a leader, Paul Revere, James Otis. These men were Freemasons. And many of them are from the Lodge of St. Andrews, the ancient lodge in the city. There were also several modern lodges, First Lodge and Second Lodge, less creatively named. So there's the St. John's Grand Lodge. This is the oldest lodge and the oldest Grand Lodge in the United States. Well, here's some of the hard data on the Sons of Liberty. Most of these important leaders, most of the top patriots in Boston, other than Samuel and John Adams, who do not appear to have been Masons, came together as Freemasons before the Stamp Act crisis. Many joined the Lodge of St. Andrews between 1760 and 1762, some others up into 1764. And I'll give you an example. On September 30th of 1761, St. Andrew's Lodge initiated Dr. Joseph Ward. He will, of course, eventually be the leader of the Sons of Liberty, one of the leaders of the revolution up until his death at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was proposed by another man, a man named William Palfrey, who served as secretary of the Lodge, later as secretary of the Grand Lodge, but also as the secretary of the Sons of Liberty, as well as other groups that became involved in the revolution. The Merchants Club, for example. Many of the merchants are, of course, Masons, as you would probably imagine. Who was present that night? Well, actually, William Palfrey also, by the way, served as paymaster for the Continental Army before he died. The presiding master was a man named William Burbeck, an artillery officer in 2 colonial wars and later in the Revolution, and almost certainly a man who was spying on the British troops in his capacity both as the head of, as in charge of ammunition and stores at Castle William, where they were stationed, and as deputy Grand Master, where there were several lodges that he had access to. But also Paul Revere, who was serving in Lodge that night. This is where Warren and Revere met. Revere would later be essentially a lieutenant for Joseph Warren, who would be running much of the subversive activity in the city. But we have others. The senior warden, a man named Joseph Webb. Again, these are not famous names unless you're a revolutionary historian, but they were actually major players as well. A man named Moses Deschen, who was a Mason from originally Rhode Island. John Jenkins, a future rebel artillery commander named Thomas Crafts, a man named Joseph Tyler with Masonic and business and political connections throughout New England. And so a number of others. And many of these will be leaders of the Sons of Liberty when the Stamp Act crisis hits. There are also several known future participants in the Boston Tea Party. We don't know all of the participants, so a statistical breakdown there is less meaningful, but Thomas Uran, who is going to serve as Master Pro Temp for the meeting that night, closed the lodge, and then was documented as taking part in throwing the tea. Another man named Samuel Peck, of course, Warren and Revere themselves. So of the 20 members and 14 visitors that night, a significant number became politically involved. And there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye as well. So in the lead up to the crisis, of course, many of these men are becoming Masons. They get to know each other. This often crosses class lines or professional lines and boundaries. The lodge, of course, owns the Green Dragon, which comes to be known as the headquarters of the revolution, because there's a number of subversive groups meeting there. Again, the North End Caucus, which is formed by Dr. Joseph Warren, moves its meetings there. 30% of the membership that we know of are Masons. They moved there just before the Boston Tea Party, the Ancient and Honorable Artillery Club, commanded by Mason Richard Gridley. So many, many others. Many of these groups are meeting here as well. And overall, of the known Sons of Liberty, and we don't know all the Sons of Liberty, because of course you don't want to keep listings of your conspiracy against the government, but they had a big dinner one night, and William Palfrey, being the secretary that he was, did keep a list. Of the 355 names on that list in the 1769 dinner that they held, or the 355 names, we have about 30%, just under 30%, that we can confirm to have Masons. And keep in mind, the records for First Lodge, which was the largest lodge in the city, were incomplete. And so this is, most likely an undercount. It's essentially a bare minimum. And at this point, during the Stamp Act crisis, over time, there's a general consensus in Masonic scholarship that the ancients tended to be the more radical revolutionaries, and the moderns tended to either sit on the fence or tend towards the Tory side. That's a tendency. It's not always true. There are lodges like the ones in Marblehead, Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in New Hampshire, that are modern lodges that are patriot lodges all the way through. And all of these are part of the network coming out of Boston. But again, anywhere between at least a quarter or more like 30% are men who have been Masons since before the Stamp Act crisis starts. And it's fairly even. I mean, there's at least 37 members of St. Andrews. There are at least 34 positively identified members of the First and Second Lodge, the modern lodges. And there are others who show up in visitors' records, or, at least 13 who belong to both groups. And it involves some very interesting people. I'll give you just a few of them, and you can read the book for more. We have a man named William Molino. He shows up both in modern lodges and in the ancient Grand Lodge. He is a merchant, and he's also well known for organizing two types of revolutionary activities. He organizes women into these sewing bees to patriotically make clothes. He also organizes young men into gangs to tar and feather Tories. And so this is, his major contribution. He eventually died under suspicious circumstances. Who else do we have? We have, of course, Revere, Warren, Palfrey themselves, Richard Gridley, the modern, who is going to command the artillery at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so there's a pretty strong overlap. And now, of course, the lodges themselves don't have enough personnel to provide all of the sons. But the fact that their leadership came out of the lodges, met and led the lodges together first, and that much of the core and many of the people who are kind of the boots on the ground, the sergeants and lieutenants of the movement, also were Masons before it got going, is pretty telling. And as I go into a little bit in this book and more in the book, shameless plug, that I have coming out, from what we can tell based on the scant records from the Sons in other areas, this tends to be true across the colonies. And the networking that the Sons of Liberty do tends often to follow Masonic lines of communication. When Palfrey is writing to New Hampshire Sons or to the Rhode Island Sons, the people he's sending it to and the taverns that he's sending these correspondence to are generally the same as when he is corresponding in his capacity as Grand Secretary. Some other interesting tidbits about the Sons in Boston: they had secret signs and handshakes, basically words and grips and passwords, which again seems fairly Masonic. They did have in the constitutions that we've seen from, or the kind of rules and bylaws and correspondence that do survive, strict rules about equality. And you see some Masonic signs and symbols referenced, like the beehive and the compasses as well, referenced by members who were Masons. And so there's a heavy overlap, a heavy Masonic overlap. The meeting place of the Sons, as well as many other subversive groups, was owned by the Masons. Their leadership is Masonic, often fulfilling the same roles. Joseph Warren, leader of the Sons of Liberty, Grand Master. Before Warren took over, in the less radical stage, in the beginning, you had the other Grand Master in Boston, John Rowe, listed as a leader of the Sons of Liberty. What happens after 1768 is that the movement gets more radical. Many of those who are sort of the loyal resistance, who are resistant to taxation but don't want to have a revolution, step to the sides. Rowe and many of the moderns are among them. But again, early on, he was part of the leadership. And while this is going on, we see the best relations between St. Andrews and First Lodge, which didn't always have the best relationship, because, suddenly John Rowe becomes an honorary member of St. Andrews, which he had before sort of not even recognized. And so we see some interesting stuff going on there. On the other hand, people ask, what about Tory members? Well, sure, there were Tory members. They stopped showing up once things get political. Once this Stamp Act crisis starts, you don't see the Tory members showing up much in St. Andrews or the other lodges that we have good attendance records for, with the exception to some extent of Second Lodge, but I get into that. It seems there was a split, and this reason led to the formation of another lodge, Rising Sun, which becomes more patriot heavy. And then Second Lodge becomes this kind of truncated little lodge that essentially disappears over time. The stamp collector, though, Andrew Oliver, was a very active Mason until he became the stamp collector. All of a sudden, his name goes from appearing in every Master's Lodge meeting to disappearing from every meeting. Other than that, let's see. I'm going to move a little quickly, in part because I have a screaming baby I'm going to have to pick up because my wife is picking up our son. All of the masters of the lodge between this 1760 and 1776 are also very active patriots. Men like John Lowell, who works for John Hancock, Joseph Snelling, Paul Revere, Samuel Barrett, who's at the Tea Party and is a Son of Liberty, William Burbick, who I've already mentioned, another son named Joseph Webb. So I guess if we could move to the next slide. This is the lodge meeting from the night of December 16th, the night of the Boston Tea Party. And again, there's always been a story that the Tea Party was conceived at the lodge and carried out by not only the Sons of Liberty, the North End Caucus, and other groups. And again, where does that come from? Well, it comes from some of the records of the lodge, of St. Andrew's Lodge, and especially the Centennial Memorial, their 100-year memorial. And yes, that is long after the fact. But we have a speech given by a brother, Hamilton Willis. And he was talking about some of the Revolutionary veterans who had served in the lodge. And he mentions a man named Colonel Henry Perkett. who was, again, a revolutionary, a member of that North End caucus. And he says, "Our brother, the colonel, by what he used to say, as well as by what he did not say, declared that the Boston Tea Party was got up at the Green Dragon Tavern and in St. Andrew's Lodge." Now, what's interesting, of course, this is secondhand. This is coming from somebody who knew Perkett. Perkett was not a member of the lodge at the time. He was an apprentice to a member of the lodge, a man named Samuel Peck. They were barrel makers, if I recall correctly. Well, Peck is known to have asked in town meeting if tea was miscible in salt water. He was an active member of the lodge and of the North End caucus, and he is documented as having taken part in the Boston Tea Party. So apparently, he goes home. He actually told Perkett not to participate. Perkett disobeyed his master, which an apprentice wasn't supposed to do, but he did. And from there, so he knew that it was got up in the lodge. He wasn't privy to that conversation, but he participated and later became a member of the lodge. Now, we see a lot of interesting activity in the lead up. There were a lot of meetings with not a lot of Masonic work going on. And for example, on November 30th, they held a meeting. It was not their regular night, and they essentially said, meeting canceled, consignment of tea took up the brethren's time, something along those lines. And again, why did you even have the meeting? Well, it was probably some sort of cover. So now we get to the meeting on the night of the 16th itself. And there has been a huge town meeting in Boston. Samuel Adams gives his famous declaration that he can do nothing else to save the country. And out from several buildings, including the Green Dragon Tavern, issue these men dressed in Native American costumes, claiming to be Mohawks. They go down, they break up 342 chests of tea. They don't pay for the tea. They do pay for the one padlock that they damaged by accident. Now, these are the minutes of the meeting from that night. We have Thomas Huron, who is known to have been at the Tea Party. His makeup apparently wasn't good enough, perhaps because he was busy holding lodge, so that he was identified. And we have 4 other members, including Samuel Webb. He's definitely Hoskins. These are also Sons of Liberty. Yes, that is what the November 30 said. I remembered it correctly. And what does it say? Lodge closed on account of the few members present until tomorrow evening. And we get this series of little dashes that look much like the letter T. And it's hard to say for sure. You can debate, are these T's or just squiggles? Nothing like this appears anywhere else in the records. And so if they aren't the letter T, they are certainly unique. Huron goes out with the other 4. They take part in the Tea Party. There's a meeting the next night at which a tremendous amount of Masonic work is conducted. Degrees, people are either initiated or are voted on. Many of these people are people who seem to have been involved in the Patriot cause. And so it seems like there was a lot of interaction and a lot of work. And again, that North End caucus run by who, once again, Grandmaster Joseph Warren, had moved into the Green Dragon just before, and in fact, they met, I believe, the same day, November 30th, at the Green Dragon. So that gives you a little bit of a hint into why this other meeting was adjourned. And so it certainly seems like the lodge took an active role. If not, there just happened to be a lot of people dressed as Indians in their building that night when they were holding a special meeting, which seems like a big coincidence. Finally, very shortly, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to finish up because I do have to, grab the baby, and you probably want to go. We have some of the participants here. Warren, the Joseph Warren Medal, which you can win in Massachusetts if you do a lot of Masonic service. I was lucky enough to nominate one man to get this. I don't think I'll ever earn it. Gridley, of course, the artillery commander, who is one of the leading modern patriots. Down here, William Dawes, who goes with Paul Revere. Here's Paul Revere himself. And this was also, it seems, a Masonic project. The man who gets credit for hanging the lanterns is a man named William Dawes. He was a member of Second Lodge. He gets credit because 100 years afterwards, on the centennial, he told the newspapers that the British redcoats had come and questioned. His family said that they'd come and questioned their ancestor. They did. And he immediately gave them the name of another Mason, a man named William Pulling, who's probably the man who actually did it. A close friend of Paul Revere, a Mason in both Marblehead and Boston since 1760. Paul Revere's own account says that he chose a friend to do this. Essentially, Pulling was they were both members of the church, Pulling and Dawes. Pulling outranked Dawes. When the redcoats showed up at Dawes's house and said, did you unlock the church to hang the lanterns in there? He said, no, John Pulling came to got my keys and I had to give it to him. And that's all I know. Either he was not involved or he was, but he turned snitch right away. However, Pulling escaped happily. They did break up his shop and take his property. He got out. So again, this is a very close Masonic connection. He and Revere had been friends Masonically since 1760. And there's a little bit more on Paul Revere's ride that we can work into that. Of course, William Dawes, who was the other rider to Warren, Hancock, and Adams, also a Mason, and he played some other interesting roles in the Revolution as well. So I'm going to leave you there. I will give, if you give my final slide for the shameless plug, yes, I have a book coming out, 18th Century Freemasonry in the Revolutionary Atlantic World. It's scheduled for September. That might get pushed back by a month or two because I may have to push back my final edits. But thank you for listening. If you have questions, I am happy to take them.
Okay, first off, Hans, do you believe that Freemasonry ultimately takes on the political and social baggage of the country it takes root in, instead of, as is often perceived, it being an institution which has freedom and rebellion at its heart?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and it's something that Freemasonry does become involved, in the latter half of the 1700s in various political movements in various places. I think Jessica Harlan Jacobs did a great job of detailing the way Irish lodges were involved in the Wolf Tone Revolution, for example, and there's others. I have in the book some interesting data on Haiti, or Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti. At that time, Freemasonry did a lot of things. First off, intellectually, it's part of the Enlightenment, which is part of this revolutionary kind of, which drives a lot of the more radical politics. If you read Rick Berman's excellent work on the connection between the Grand Lodge and Whig politics earlier on, of course, in America, it is the Whigs who are leading the revolution. They just interpret Whig politics in a much different way than the Whigs in Britain that they're rebelling against. It also is networking a lot of members of the classes that are going to tend to rebel. And it is the most extensive network. It's transatlantic. It certainly covers all of the American colonies. Many of these people are, again, men of commerce and business. It's using these commercial connections. In the Ancients and the Lodge of St. Andrews, many of them are these rising middle classes of artisans who feel frustrated by the social system. So Freemasonry has, in many times and places, been co-opted. I know the Carbonari movement in Italy is another example. It gives you a trust network. It gives you an organizing template, a structure which can be used to organize like a semi-secretive group. So it has a lot of advantages for those looking to organize. It has, in the 18th century context, a lot of politicized language and ideas. And that I don't think is so much the case today. I don't think there's anything particularly political about us. I was very disappointed when I joined and realized that I wasn't going to get to be part of the New World Order after all. But at the time, that was very much more the case. Hopefully I answered that fairly clearly.
You did, thanks. The next question is, in your view, does Massachusetts Freemasonry remain a very, in air quotes, authentic jurisdiction, i.e. working in a manner closer to that of the founding fathers, versus the innovations which are perhaps found elsewhere in the United States as time moved on?
Yes, I believe it so. And I don't, off the top of my head, I'm having trouble remembering exactly when all the ritual was codified, but it was earlier on than many of the Grand Lodges. It was, I think, if not early 1800s, and much of what they were codifying was essentially stuff that they'd been doing in the 1700s. The ancient and modern Grand Lodges merged in 1792, and so the working is, I believe, over 2 centuries old without having been altered, other than a few minor changes that, again, I would. For example, well, I won't go into examples because it's whatever, but I don't want to give away any secrets. But essentially, my impression is that it is an older working, closer to the original working, and some of the language for that reason is a bit hard for some of our officers to get their tongues around when they first learn their lectures.
One last question. Would you say that Freemasonry in New England is a kind of rite of passage for young men native to the region due to its roots in the revolutionary history in that specific geography?
Not in the present day. I mean, it was very major. It was a very major social network, up through the anti-Masonic purges. It did recover. I think it is one of the stronger districts. It is the oldest Grand Lodge in the hemisphere, but Masonry in general is not as big a part of the consciousness of young men in this generation, unfortunately. And I wouldn't say it's a rite of passage. But I mean, we do get many applicants because of the history, because of the heritage. And so, that is a selling point here that I think is one of the things that keeps us one of the more active states Masonically.
Thank you so much, Hans. And thank you everybody else for listening in.